A proposed new policy at City Hall would require councillors to disclose any personal relationships they have with staff. A disclosure policy is in place for City of Ottawa employees, but councillors are not currently required to do so. Speaking to reporters after the council meeting, outgoing Mayor Jim Watson said the motion is about ensuring councillors are held to a high standard. An attempt to defer approval of the motion failed, and it ultimately passed. Joining us now with more on this is Alex Lucifero. He's an employment lawyer and partner with Samfiru Tumarkin. Hi, Alex. Good to see you.
Good morning.
What do you make of this motion at Ottawa City Hall?
Well, I think it's long overdue, and quite frankly, I think most workplaces nowadays need to have policies with respect to personal relationships, with respect to romantic relationships in the workplace, whether it's councillors in the City of Ottawa or, again, any other workplace. This is one of the most fundamental policies, really, that an employer can have. You want to make sure that, especially when it comes to management level and subordinate level employees, where there is an imbalance of power there, you want to make sure, because of a potential conflict of interest and because of the issues that it could arise, that there is a policy in place requiring employees to disclose such relationships.
What is the usual standard for this kind of relationship in the workplace?
Well, what we don't want to see in the workplace necessarily, Annette, is a policy that absolutely bans personal relationships, because really all that does is drive those relationships potentially underground. Romantic relationships are going to happen where there's interactions between individuals. And so, again, you don't want an outright ban. What you want is a policy requiring disclosure, as the councillors had voted for, and as apparently the City of Ottawa has for its regular employees. And you want a policy as well where, again, when you're dealing with employees at different levels of employment, for example, a management level employee that has a relationship with a subordinate employee, you want to, as much as possible, really make sure that those relationships are limited, again, because there's an inherent imbalance of power in that relationship, and that makes consent questionable at any time. And so, in my opinion, as an employment lawyer, I think those relationships in the workplace are quite problematic. They're conflicts of interest, and you want to avoid them.
Does it pose a privacy issue if you have to disclose everything? Some people may find concern in that.
Not necessarily, no. I don't think there's a privacy interest there. Again, because it's so important. Keep in mind, employers have an obligation to maintain a healthy, safe work environment. And you are potentially breaching that obligation as an employer if you're allowing those kinds of relationships in the workplace. And again, I'm talking specifically about a relationship between a subordinate and more senior or management level employee, where, again, that can lead to all sorts of issues, putting that employee in jeopardy potentially, because, for example, a boss and their secretary, if the boss invites the secretary out to dinner or something of the sort, you always have to question whether consent is 100% in a situation where perhaps the employee is thinking, well, if I don't accept this invitation, my job might be in jeopardy.
Where is the line drawn when it comes to who is responsible in the end if the relationship is not disclosed? For example, if it is between a boss and a secretary, is she at risk of losing, or he as the secretary at risk of losing their job, or could the boss be the one who should be held accountable? Where's that line drawn?
Yeah, it really depends on the severity of the incident, and it needs to be said. And in some cases where, for example, there's a serious conflict of interest, or where the business interests of the employer are put in jeopardy as a result of this relationship, it may rise to the level of requiring an employer to terminate the employment of those employees. If it's not particularly severe, well, then progressive discipline needs to be implemented, perhaps a reprimand and perhaps a suspension, but it really depends on severity, and it goes back to whether the interests of the employer have been impacted, whether a conflict of interest exists. I would say in most cases, Annette, oftentimes this is more an educational process than anything else. Employers and employees need to be made aware that these kinds of relationships exist in the workplace, and they could potentially cause damage. They could cause damage to the employees themselves, as well as cause damage, again, to the interests of the employer.
I'm curious, Alex, we talked off the top about the fact that there is such a policy in place for City of Ottawa employees. Is it common to have it for elected officials?
I mean, it certainly should be. I mean, it's a workplace like any other, and I would say, particularly, when we're talking about imbalances of power in the workplace, in a political setting like that, I think that's even more the case. And so, absolutely, I think, again, going back to my initial comment, I think this is a no-brainer. Quite frankly, I think it should have been done long, long ago.
All right, Alex Lucifero with Samfiru Tumarkin, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Annette.